Chapter 26 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Kristen McQuillan. Howard's End by Edward Morgan Forster. Chapter 26. Next morning a fine mist covered the peninsula. The weather promised well, and the outline of the castle mound grew clearer each moment that Margaret watched it. Presently she saw the keep, and the sun painted the rubble gold and charged the white sky with blue. The shadow of the house gathered itself together and fell over the garden. A cat looked up at her window and mewed. Lastly the river appeared, still holding the mists between its banks and its overhanging alders, and only visible as far as a hill which cut off its upper reaches. Margaret was fascinated by Onnington. She had said that she loved it, but it was rather its romantic tension that held her. The rounded druids of whom she'd caught glimpses in her drive, the rivers hurrying down from them to England, the carelessly modelled masses of the lower hills thrilled her with poetry. The house was insignificant, but the prospect from it would be an eternal joy, and she thought of all the friends that she would have to stop in it, and of the conversion of Henry himself to a rural life. Society, too, promised favourably. The rector of the parish had dined with them last night, and she had found that he was a friend of her father's, and so knew what to find in her. She liked him. He would introduce her to the town, while on the other side Sir James Bidder sat, repeating that she had only to give the word and he would whip up the country families for 20 miles round. Whether Sir James, who was Garden Seeds, had promised what he could perform she doubted, but so long as Henry mistook them for the country families when they did call, she was content. Charles and Albert Fussell now crossed the lawn. They were going for a morning dip, and a servant followed them with their bathing dresses. She had meant to take a stroll herself before breakfast, but she saw that the day was still sacred to men, and amused herself by watching their contretemps. In the first place, the key of the bathing shed could not be found. Charles stood by the riverside with folded hands, tragical, while the servant shouted and was misunderstood by another servant in the garden. Then came a difficulty about a springboard, and soon 3 people were running backwards and forwards over the meadow with orders and counter-orders and recriminations and apologies. If Margaret wanted to jump from a motor-car, she jumped. If Tibby thought paddling would benefit his ankles, he paddled. If a clerk desired adventure, he took a walk in the dark. But these athletes seemed paralyzed. They could not bathe without their appliances, though the morning sun was calling and the last mists were rising from the dimpling stream. Had they found the life of the body after all? Could not the men whom they despised as milksops beat them even on their own ground? She thought of the bathing arrangements as they should be in her day. No worrying of servants, no appliances. Beyond good sense. Her reflections were disturbed by the quiet child who had come to speak to the cat, but was now watching her watch the men. She called, "Good morning, dear," a little sharply. Her voice spread consternation. Charles looked round, and though completely attired in indigo blue, vanished into the shed and was seen no more. "Miss Wilcox is up," the child whispered, and then became unintelligible. "What's that?" It sounded like, "Cayoke, sack back." "I can't hear." "On the bed, tissue paper." Gathering that the wedding dress was on view and a visit would be seemly, she went to Evie's room. All was hilarity here. Evie, in a petticoat, was dancing with one of the Anglo-Indian ladies, while the other was adoring yards of white satin. They screamed, they laughed, they sang, and the dog barked. Margaret screamed a little too, but without conviction. She could not feel that a wedding was so funny. Perhaps something was missing in her equipment. Evie gasped, "Dolly, is a rotter not to be here? Oh, we would rag just then." Then Margaret went down to breakfast. Henry was already installed. He ate slowly and spoke little, and was, in Margaret's eyes, the only member of their party who dodged emotion successfully. She could not suppose him indifferent to either the loss of his daughter or the presence of his future wife. Yet he dwelt in tact, only issuing orders occasionally, orders that promoted the comfort of his guests. He inquired after her hand. He set her to pour out the coffee, and Mrs. Warrington to pour out the tea. When Evie came down there was a moment's awkwardness, and both ladies rose to vacate their places. "Burton," called Henry, "serve tea and coffee from the sideboard." It wasn't genuine tact, but it was tact of a sort. The sort that is as useful as the genuine, and saves even more situations at board meetings. Henry treated a marriage like a funeral, item by item, never raising his eyes to the whole, and "Death, where is thy sting? Love, where is thy victory?" one would exclaim at the close. After breakfast she claimed a few words with him. It was always best to approach him formally. She asked for the interview because he was going on to shoot grouse tomorrow, and she was returning to Helen in town. "Certainly, dear," he said. "Of course I have the time. What do you want?" "Nothing." "I was afraid something had gone wrong." "No, I have nothing to say, but you may talk." Glancing at his watch, he talked of the nasty curve at the lich gate. She heard him with interest. Her surface could always respond to his without contempt, though all her deeper being might be yearning to help him. She had abandoned any plan of action. Love is the best, and the more she let herself love him, the more chance was there that he would set his soul in order. Such a moment as this, when they sat under fair weather by the walks of their future home, was so sweet to her that its sweetness would surely pierce to him. Each lift of his eyes, each parting of the thatched lip from the clean-shaven, must prelude the tenderness that kills the monk and the beast at a single blow. Disappointed 100 times, she still hoped. She loved him with too clear a vision to fear his cloudiness. Whether he droned trivialities as today, or sprang kisses on her in the twilight, she could pardon him, she could respond. "If there is this nasty curve," she suggested, "couldn't we walk to the church? Not, of course, you and Evie, but the rest of us might very well go on first, and that would mean fewer carriages." "One can't have ladies walking through the market square. The Fussels wouldn't like it. They were awfully particular at Charles's wedding. One of our party, was anxious to walk, and certainly the church was just round the corner, and I shouldn't have minded, but the Colonel made a great point of it." "You men shouldn't be so chivalrous," said Margaret thoughtfully. "Why not?" She knew why not, but said that she didn't know. He announced that, unless she had anything special to say, he must visit the wine cellar, and they went off together in search of Burton. Though clumsy and a little inconvenient, Oniton was a genuine country house. They clattered down flagged passages, looking into room after room, and scaring unknown maids from the performance of obscure duties. The wedding breakfast must be in readiness when they came back from church, and tea would be served in the garden. The sight of so many agitated and serious people made Margaret smile, but she reflected that they were paid to be serious, and enjoyed being agitated. Here were the lower wheels of the machine that was tossing Evie into nuptial glory. A little boy blocked their way with pigtails. His mind could not grasp their greatness, and he said, "By your leave, let me pass, please." Henry asked him where Burton was, but the servants were so new that they did not know one another's names. In the still-room sat the band, who had stipulated for champagne as part of their fee, and who were already drinking beer. Scents of Araby came from the kitchen, mingled with cries. Margaret knew what had happened there, for it happened at Wickham Place. One of the wedding dishes had boiled over, and the cook was throwing cedar shavings to hide the smell. At last they came upon the butler. Henry gave him the keys and handed Margaret down the cellar stairs. 2 doors were unlocked. She, who kept all her wine at the bottom of the linen cupboard, was astonished at the sight. "We shall never get through it," she cried, and the 2 men were suddenly drawn into brotherhood and exchanged smiles. She felt as if she had again jumped out of the car while it was moving. Certainly Oniton would take some digesting. It would be no small business to remain herself and yet to assimilate such an establishment. She must remain herself, for his sake as well as her own, since a shadowy wife degrades the husband whom she accompanies, and she must assimilate for reasons of common honesty, since she had no right to marry a man and make him uncomfortable. Her only ally was the power of home. The loss of Wickham Place had taught her more than its possession. Howard's End had repeated the lesson. She was determined to create new sanctities among these hills. After visiting the wine cellar, she dressed, and then came the wedding, which seemed a small affair when compared with the preparations for it. Everything went like 1 o'clock. Mr. Cahill materialized out of space, and was waiting for his bride at the church door. No one dropped the ring, or mispronounced the responses, or trod on Evie's train, or cried. In a few minutes the clergymen performed their duty, the register was signed, and they were back in their carriages, negotiating the dangerous curve by the lich gate. Margaret was convinced that they had not been married at all, and that the Norman Church had been intent all the time on other business. There were more documents to sign at the house, and the breakfast to eat, and then a few more people dropped in for the garden party. There had been a great many refusals. After all, it was not a very big affair, not as big as Margaret's would be. She noted the dishes and the strips of red carpet, that outwardly she might give Henry what was proper. But inwardly she hoped for something better than this blend of Sunday church and fox hunting. If only someone had been upset! But this wedding had gone off so particularly well. Quite like a Durbar, in the opinion of Lady Edser, and she thoroughly agreed with her. So the wasted day lumbered forward. The bride and bridegroom drove off, yelling with laughter, and for the second time the sun retreated towards the hills of Wales. Henry, who was more tired than he owned, came up to her in the castle meadow, and in tones of unusual softness said that he was pleased. Everything had gone off so well. She felt that he was praising her, too, and blushed. Certainly she had done all she could with his intractable friends, and had made a special point of kowtowing to the men. They were breaking camp this evening. Only the Warringtons and the quiet child would stay the night. The others were already moving towards the house to finish their packing. "I think it did go off well," she agreed. "Since I had to jump out of the motor, I am thankful I lighted on my left hand. I'm so very glad about it, Henry dear. I only hope that the guests at ours may be half as comfortable. You must all remember we have no practical person among us except my aunt, and she is not used to entertainments on a large scale." "I know," he said gravely. "Under the circumstances, it would be better to put everything into the hands of Harrods or Whiteleys, or even to go to some hotel." "You desire a hotel?" "Yes, because, well, I mustn't interfere with you. No doubt you want to be married from your old home." "My old home is falling into pieces, Henry. I only want my new. Isn't it a perfect evening?" "The Alexandrina isn't bad." "The Alexandrina," she echoed, more occupied with the threads of smoke that were issuing from their chimneys and ruling the sunlit slopes with parallels of grey. "It's off Curzon Street." "Is it? Let's be married from off Curzon Street." Then she turned westward to gaze at the swirling gold. Just where the river rounded the hill, the sun caught it. Fairyland must lie above the bend, and its precious liquid was pouring towards them past Charles' bathing shed. She gazed so long that her eyes were dazzled, and when they moved back into the house, she could not recognize the faces of the people who were coming out of it. A parlour-maid was preceding them. "Who are those people?" she asked. "They're callers," exclaimed Henry. "It's too late for callers." "Perhaps they're town people who wanted to see the wedding presents." "I'm not at home yet to townies." "Well, hide among the ruins, and if I can stop them, I will." He thanked her. Margaret went forward, smiling socially. She supposed that these were unpunctual guests, who would have to be content with vicarious civility, since Evie and Charles were gone, Henry tired, and the others in their rooms. She assumed the air of a hostess. But not for long, for one of the group was Helen in her oldest clothes, and dominated by that tense, wounding excitement that had made her a terror in their nursery days. "What is it?" she called. "Oh, what's wrong? Is Tibby ill?" Helen spoke to her two companions, who fell back. Then she bore furiously forward. "They're starving!" she shouted. "I found them starving!" "Who? Why have you come?" "The Basts." "Oh, Helen," moaned Margaret. "Whatever have you done now?" "He's lost his place. He's been turned out of the bank. Yes, he's done for. We upper classes have ruined him, and I suppose you'll tell me that it's the battle of life. Starving. His wife is ill. Starving. She fainted in the train." "Helen, are you mad?" "Perhaps. Yes, if you like, I'm mad, but I've brought them. I'll stand injustice no longer. I'll show up the wretchedness that lies under this luxury, this talk of impersonal forces, this cant about God doing what we're all too slack to do ourselves." "Have you actually brought two starving people from London to Shropshire, Helen?" Helen was checked. She had not thought of this, and her hysteria abated. "There was a restaurant car on the train," she said. "Don't be absurd. They aren't starving, and you know it. Now, begin from the beginning. I won't have such theatrical nonsense." "How dare you? Yes, how dare you?" she repeated, as anger filled her. "Bursting into Evie's wedding in this heartless way. My goodness, but you've a perverted notion of philanthropy. Look," she indicated the house. "Servants, people out the windows. They think it's some sort of vulgar scandal, and I must explain. Oh, no, it's only my sister screaming and 2 hangers-on of ours, who she's brought here for no conceivable reason." "Kindly take back that word hangers-on," said Helen, ominously calm. "Very well," conceded Margaret, who, for all her wrath, was determined to avoid a real quarrel. "I, too, am sorry about them, but it beats me why you brought them here or why you're here yourself." "It's our last chance of seeing Mr. Wilcox." Margaret moved towards the house at this. She was determined not to worry Henry. "He's going to Scotland. I know he is. I insist on seeing him." "Yes, tomorrow." "I knew it was our last chance." "How do you do, Mr. Bast?" said Margaret, trying to control her voice. "This is an odd business. What view do you take of it?" "There is Mrs. Bast, too," prompted Helen. Jackie also shook hands. She, like her husband, was shy, and furthermore ill, and furthermore so bestially stupid that she could not grasp what was happening. She only knew that the lady had swept down like a whirlwind last night, had paid the rent, redeemed the furniture, provided them with a dinner and breakfast, and ordered them to meet her at Paddington next morning. Leonard had feebly protested, and when morning came had suggested that they did not go, but she, half mesmerized, obeyed. The lady had told them to, and they must, and their bed-sitting room had accordingly changed into Paddington, and Paddington into a railway carriage that shook and grew hot and grew cold, and vanished entirely, and reappeared amid torrents of expensive scent. "You've fainted," said the lady in an awestruck voice. "Perhaps the air will do you good." And perhaps it had, for here she was, feeling rather better among a lot of flowers. "I'm sure I don't want to intrude," began Leonard in answer to Margaret's question, "but you've been so kind to me in the past in warning me about the Porphyrion that I wondered whether we could get him back into the Porphyrion again," supplied Helen. "Meg, this has been a cheerful business, a bright evening's work that was on the Chelsea Embankment." Margaret shook her head and returned to Mr. Bast. "I don't understand. You left the Porphyrion because we suggested it was a bad concern, didn't you?" "That's right." "And went into a bank instead." "I told you all that," said Helen. "And they reduced their staff after he'd been there a month, and now he's penniless, and I consider that we and our informant are directly to blame." "I hate all this," Leonard muttered. "I hope you do, Mr. Bast, but it's no good mincing matters. You've done yourself no good by coming here. If you intend to confront Mr. Wilcox, and to call him to account for a chance remark, you'll make a very great mistake." "I brought them. I did it all," cried Helen. "I can only advise you to go at once. My sister has put you in a false position, and it is kindest to tell you so. It's too late to get to town, but you'll find a comfortable hotel where Mrs. Bast can rest, and I hope you'll be my guests there." "That isn't what I want, Miss Schlegel," said Leonard. "You're very kind, and no doubt it's a false position, but you make me miserable. I seem no good at all." "It's work he wants," interpreted Helen. "Can't you see?" Then he said, "Jackie, let's go. We're more bothered than we're worth. We're costing these ladies pounds and pounds already to get work for us, and they never will. There's nothing we're good enough to do." "We would like to find you work," said Margaret rather conventionally. "We want to, I, like my sister. You're only down in your luck. Go to the hotel, have a good night's rest, and some day you shall pay me back the bill if you prefer it." But Leonard was near the abyss, and at such moments men see clearly. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I shall never get work now. If rich people fail at one profession, they can try another. Not I. I had my groove, and I've got out of it. I could do one particular branch of insurance in one particular office well enough to command a salary, but that's all. Poetry's nothing, Miss Schlegel. One's thoughts about this and that are nothing. Your money, too, is nothing, if you'll understand me. I mean, if a man over 20 once loses his own particular job, it's all over with him. I have seen it happen to others. Their friends gave them money for a little, but in the end they fall over the edge. It's no good. It's the whole world pulling. There will always be rich and poor." He ceased. "Won't you have something to eat?" said Margaret. "I don't know what to do. It isn't my house, and though Mr. Wilcox would be glad to see you at any other time, as I say, I don't know what to do, but I undertake to do what I can for you. Helen, offer them something. Do try a sandwich, Mrs. Bast." They moved to a long table, behind which a servant was still standing. Iced cakes, sandwiches innumerable, coffee, claret cup, champagne remained almost intact. Their overfed guests could do no more. Leonard refused. Jackie thought that she could manage a little. Margaret left them whispering together and had a few more words with Helen. She said, "Helen, I like Mr. Bast. I agree he's worth helping. I agree that we are directly responsible." "No, indirectly, via Mr. Wilcox." "Let me tell you, once and for all, that if you take up that attitude, I'll do nothing. No doubt you're right logically and are entitled to say a great many scathing things about Henry, only I won't have it. So choose." Helen looked at the sunset. "If you promise to take them quietly to the George, I will speak to Henry about them. In my own way, mind. There is to be none of this absurd screaming about justice. I have no use for justice. If it was only a question of money, we could do it ourselves. But he wants work, and that we can't give him. But possibly Henry can." "It's his duty to," grumbled Helen. "Nor am I concerned with duty. I'm concerned with the characters of various people whom we know, and how, things being as they are, things may be made a little better. Mr. Wilcox hates being asked favors. All business men do, but I am going to ask him at the risk of a rebuff because I want to make things a little better." "Very well, I promise. You take it very calmly." "Take them off to the George and I'll try. Poor creatures, but they look tired." As they parted, she added, "I haven't nearly done with you, though, Helen. You have been most self-indulgent. I can't get over it. You have less restraint rather than more as you grow older. Think it over and alter yourself, or we shan't have happy lives." She rejoined Henry. Fortunately, he had been sitting down. These physical matters were important. "Was it townies?" he asked, greeting her with a pleasant smile. "You'll never believe me," said Margaret, sitting down beside him. "It's all right now, but it was my sister." "Helen here?" he cried, preparing to rise. "But she refused the invitation. I thought she despised weddings." "Don't get up. She's not come to the wedding. I've bundled her off to the George." Inherently hospitable, he protested. "No, she has 2 of her protégées with her, and must keep with them." "Let 'em all come." "My dear Henry, did you see them?" "I did catch sight of a brown bunch of a woman, certainly." "The brown bunch was Helen. But did you catch sight of a sea green and salmon bunch?" "What, are they out bean feasting?" "No, business. They wanted to see me, and later on I want to talk to you about them." She was ashamed of her own diplomacy. In dealing with Wilcox, how tempting it was to lapse from comradeship, and to give him the kind of woman that he desired. Henry took the hint at once, and said, "Why later on? Tell me now. No time like the present." "Shall I?" "If it isn't a long story." "Oh, no, not 5 minutes, but there's a sting at the end of it, for I want you to find the man some work in your office." "What are his qualifications?" "I don't know. He's a clerk." "How old?" 25, perhaps." "What's his name?" "Bast," said Margaret, and was about to remind him that they had met at Wickham Place, but stopped herself. It had not been a successful meeting. "Where was he before?" "Dempster's Bank." "Why did he leave?" he asked, still remembering nothing. "They reduced their staff." "All right, I'll see him." It was the reward of her tact and devotion through the day. Now she understood why some women prefer influence to rights. Mrs. Plinlimmon, when condemning suffragettes, had said, "The woman who can't influence her husband to vote the way she wants ought to be ashamed of herself." Margaret had winced, but she was influencing Henry now, and though pleased at her little victory, she knew that she had won it by the methods of the harem. "I should be glad if you took him," she said, "but I don't know whether he's qualified." "I'll do what I can, but Margaret, this mustn't be taken as a precedent." "No, of course, of course." "I can't fit in your protégés every day. Business would suffer." "I can promise you he's the last. He's rather a special case." "Protégés always are." She let it stand at that. He rose with a little extra touch of complacency and held out his hand to help her up. How wide the gulf between Henry as he was, and Henry as Helen thought he ought to be! And she herself, hovering as usual between the two, now accepting men as they are, now yearning with her sister for truth. Love and truth. Their warfare seems eternal. Perhaps the whole visible world rests on it, and if they were one, life itself, like the spirits when Prospero was reconciled to his brother, might vanish into air. into thin air. "Your protégé has made us late," he said. "The Fussels will just be starting." On the whole, she sided with men as they are. Henry would save the Basts as he had saved Howard's End, while Helen and her friends were discussing the ethics of salvation. His was a slapdash method, but the world had been built slapdash, and the beauty of mountain and river and sunset may be but the varnish with which the unskilled artificer hides his joins. Oniton, like herself, was imperfect. Its apple trees were stunted, its castle ruinous. It, too, had suffered in the border warfare between the Anglo-Saxon and the Celt, between things as they are and as they ought to be. Once more the west was retreating. Once again the orderly stars were dotting the eastern sky. There is certainly no rest for us on the earth. But there is happiness, and as Margaret descended the mound on her lover's arm, she felt that she was having her share. To her annoyance, Mrs. Bast was still in the garden. The husband and Helen had left her there to finish her meal while they went to engage rooms. Margaret found this woman repellent. She had felt, when shaking her hand, an overpowering shame. She remembered the motive of her call at Wickham Place, and smelt again the odours from the abyss, odours the more disturbing because they were involuntary. For there was no malice in Jackie. There she sat, a piece of cake in one hand, an empty champagne glass in the other, doing no harm to anybody. "She's overtired," Margaret whispered. "She's something else," said Henry. "This won't do. I can't have her in my garden in this state." "Is she—" Margaret hesitated to add drunk. Now that she was going to marry him, he had grown particular. He discountenanced risque conversations now. Henry went up to the woman. She raised her face, which gleamed in the twilight like a puff-ball. "Madam, you will be more comfortable at the hotel," he said sharply. Jackie replied, "If it isn't Hen!" "Ne crois pas que le mari lui ressemble," apologized Margaret. "Il est tout à fait différent." "Henry!" she repeated quite distinctly. Mr. Wilcox was much annoyed. "I can't congratulate you on your protégés," he remarked. "Hen, don't go. You do love me, dear, don't you?" "Bless us, what a person!" sighed Margaret, gathering up her skirts. Jackie pointed with her cake. "You're a nice boy, you are," she yawned. "There now, I love you." "Henry, I am awfully sorry." "And pray why?" he asked, and looked at her so sternly that she feared he was ill. He seemed more scandalized than the facts demanded. "To have brought this down on you." "Pray don't apologize." The voice continued. "Why does she call you Hen?" said Margaret innocently. "Has she ever seen you before?" "Seen Hen before?" said Jackie. "Who hasn't seen Hen? He's serving you like me, my dear. These boys, you wait. Still, we love 'em." "Are you now satisfied?" Henry asked. Margaret began to grow frightened. "I don't know what this is all about," she said. "Let's come in." But he thought she was acting. He thought he was trapped. He saw his whole life crumbling. "Don't you, indeed?" he said bitingly. "I do. Allow me to congratulate you on the success of your plan." "This is Helen's plan, not mine." "I now understand your interest in the Basts. Very well thought out. I'm amused at your caution, Margaret. You are quite right. It was necessary. I am a man, and I've lived a man's past. I have the honor to release you from your engagement." Still she could not understand. She knew of life's seamy side as a theory. She could not grasp it as a fact. More words from Jackie were necessary. Words unequivocal, undenied. "So that—" burst from her, and she went indoors. She stopped herself from saying more. "So what?" asked Colonel Fussell, who was getting ready to start in the hall. "We were saying— Henry and I were just having the fiercest argument. My point being—" Seizing his fur coat from a footman, she offered to help him on. He protested, and there was a playful little scene. "No, let me do that," said Henry, following. "Thanks so much. You see, he's forgiven me," the Colonel said gallantly. "I don't expect there's much to forgive." He got into the car. The ladies followed him after an interval. Maids, courier, and heavier luggage had been sent on earlier by the branch line. Still chattering, still thanking their host and patronizing their future hostess, the guests were home away. Then Margaret continued. So that woman has been your mistress?"
"You put it with your usual delicacy," he replied.
"When, please?"
"Why?"
"When, please?"
10 years ago."
She left him without a word, for it was not her tragedy, it was Mrs. Wilcox's.
End of chapter 26.